Jesus healed most people in the Gospels with nothing more than a single word or a gentle touch. And yet, in a moment that stopped everyone in their tracks, he did something strange. He spat on the ground, worked the dirt into clay with his own hands, and placed it directly onto a blind man's eyes. This was not a random act, nor was it a simple first-century medical remedy. This was a deliberate act, loaded with profound meaning that reaches all the way back to the creation of humanity in the book of Genesis. By forming clay from the dust on the Sabbath, Jesus wasn't just performing a miracle. He was reenacting creation itself and making an undeniable claim to his divine authority as the creator. Warning, layer number 6, the hidden, meaning inside the name of the pool he sent, the man to, ties this entire miracle directly to Jesus's ultimate identity. Let's look at the hidden, layers behind why Jesus used dirt to heal blind eyes, and how it changes everything you know about this miracle. Jesus healed most people in the Gospels with nothing more than a single word or the simple touch of a hand. Speak, and a servant is healed from a distance. Touch, and a bleeding woman is instantly well. Say the word, and a paralyzed man picks up his own mat and walks. And then, in at least 2 separate recorded moments, he does something strange. He spits on the ground. He works the spit into the dirt with his own fingers until it becomes clay. And he physically applies that clay by hand to a pair of blind eyes. This is not a random detail. This is not simply a first-century remedy Jesus happened to reach for. This is not incidental to the miracle itself. This is a deliberate act loaded with meaning that reaches all the way back to the very first chapters of Genesis. And once you see it, you won't read this miracle the same way again. Let's start with the mechanics of the healing itself, because John records this scene in careful, specific detail. Jesus sees a man blind from birth. He spat on the ground, John writes, and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, "Go, wash in the Pool of Siloam." So he went and washed and came back seeing. The Greek word for the clay here is pelos, mud, potter's clay, a specific, deliberately chosen word. And the verb for spit, patio, describes an unusually intimate physical act for a miracle account. This isn't Jesus simply speaking healing into existence from a comfortable distance. This is Jesus kneeling or bending down, mixing something with his own hands and applying it directly, physically, to another person's face. Here's what should immediately strike you. This man was blind from birth, meaning there was nothing physically wrong that clay could mechanically fix. No injury to clean, no foreign object to remove. The clay wasn't medicine. It was a sign, deliberately chosen and deliberately applied. This is layer 1. The healing method itself was unusual on purpose, physical, hands-on, and completely unnecessary if the only goal was restoring sight. Layer 2 shows you this wasn't a one-time impulse. It happened again in a different town under different circumstances. At Bethsaida, a blind man is brought to Jesus and people beg him to touch him. Mark records what happens next. He spit on his eyes and put his hands on him. In this account, the healing happens in 2 distinct stages. The man first sees people, but they look like trees, walking. Only after a second touch does he see everything clearly. Notice this repeats the exact same unusual pattern. Spit, physical contact, a deliberate hands-on process rather than an instantaneous word. 2 separate healings, 2 separate towns, the same specific physical method chosen both times. This wasn't incidental. It was a pattern. Before we go further, here's where we are. The mechanics are established. Jesus repeatedly chose an unusual, physical, hands-on method for healing blind eyes specifically. Now watch where this pattern actually comes from, because it goes back to the very beginning of the Bible. Layer 3 takes you back to Genesis, to the very first chapters of the entire Bible, to the creation of the first human being. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, Genesis records, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The Hebrew word for dust here, afar, describes dry, earth, ground, dust. The exact same category of material Jesus mixes with his own saliva to form clay centuries later. This wasn't the only place this imagery shows up either. Job, describing his own creation, says to God directly, "Your hands have made me and fashioned me. Remember, I pray, that you have made me like clay." And the prophet Isaiah writes, "O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are potter, and all we are the work of your hand." By the time Jesus stands in front of a man, born blind, the image of God forming human bodies out of dust and clay was already deeply embedded in Israel's own scriptures, centuries old. Jesus wasn't introducing a strange new symbol. He was reaching directly into imagery his entire audience would have immediately recognized. This is layer 3, the material Jesus chose. Dirt mixed with his own body's saliva into clay wasn't a coincidence. It was the exact material Genesis describes God using to form the first human body. Layer 4 takes that connection one step further, and it's the step that turns this from an interesting echo into something much bigger. John's gospel opens with language that directly claims Jesus was present, active, and essential at the original creation itself. All things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that was made. And later in that same opening chapter, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Put those two facts together. If Jesus is the one John's gospel says all things were made through, then when he kneels down, mixes dirt with his own saliva, and physically forms something new on a blind man's eyes, he isn't merely referencing the Genesis creation story from a respectful distance. He's the same one who did the original forming, now doing it again, in miniature, in person, with his own hands. This is layer 4. The man who forms new eyes out of dust and spit isn't imitating the Creator. According to John's own gospel, he is the Creator, reenacting in a single small physical act the exact kind of forming work Genesis describes him doing at the very beginning of everything. Now the 5th layer, and this is where the story stops being a quiet theological echo and becomes an open confrontation. John tells you something specific and important, almost in passing. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. That single detail changes everything about how this miracle was received. Under the rabbinic Sabbath regulations developing in that period, mixing a liquid with a dry substance to form a paste, kneading, was classified among the prohibited categories of Sabbath work. Jesus didn't simply heal on the Sabbath, which was already controversial. He specifically chose a method, mixing spit and dirt into clay, that deliberately intersected with that exact prohibited category. And the Pharisees respond exactly as you'd expect. This man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Here's what most people miss about this timing. If Jesus had simply spoken a word, the healing itself might still have caused controversy, but the specific method wouldn't have been the flashpoint. By choosing to make clay and act with a specific, recognized category under Sabbath law, Jesus wasn't stumbling into controversy by accident. He was making an unmistakable claim on the one day of the week designed to test exactly this kind of claim, that his authority over creation itself, demonstrated by reenacting the forming of a human body out of dust, superseded even the Sabbath law meant to memorialize God's original rest after creation. This is layer 5, the timing wasn't incidental. Choosing to make clay specifically on the Sabbath turned a private theological echo into a public, unmistakable claim to creative authority. Precisely the kind of claim that would provoke exactly the reaction it did.
And now, the sixth and final layer, the one that ties the entire miracle back to Jesus' own identity and mission. Jesus doesn't heal the man on the spot. He sends him away with specific instructions. Go, wash in the Pool of Siloam. And John, writing carefully as always, stops to explain something most readers would otherwise miss entirely. Siloam, which is translated sent. That's not a throwaway detail. The Greek word behind sent, apostolo, is the same conceptual root John uses elsewhere, again and again, to describe Jesus' own identity and mission, as the one sent by the Father into the world. By sending the man to wash specifically in a pool whose very name means sent, Jesus is quietly, deliberately tying the healing itself to his own identity as the one who was himself sent. This is where the open loop from the very beginning finally closes. Remember the question, why the extra unnecessary physical step, and why dirt specifically? Because Jesus wasn't performing a random miracle with an odd choice of materials. He was reenacting Genesis 2:7, the forming of the first human body from dust with his own hands on the one day of the week that made the claim to creative authority impossible to ignore, and then sending the healed man to wash in a pool whose name pointed directly back to Jesus' own identity as the one sent by the Father. Every layer of this miracle, the material, the timing, and the destination, was pointing at the exact same truth from three different directions. Maybe you recognize a smaller, human version of this same instinct. Think about someone doing a task the hard way on purpose, using their own hands for something that could have been done instantly, or delegated entirely, or skipped altogether. And the moment you realize the effort itself was never inefficiency, it was the actual message chosen deliberately, because some things are worth communicating through action, not just through words. Jesus could have spoken this man's sight into existence from across the road. He chose, instead, to kneel down and use his own hands. So here is what all of this leaves you with. First, the truth of it. Jesus didn't need dirt to heal anyone. He chose it, specifically, deliberately, echoing the exact material Genesis describes God using to form the very first human body. Second, what that means for you. The timing of this miracle, deliberately chosen on the Sabbath, turned a quiet theological echo into an unmistakable public claim that the man kneeling in the dirt that day held the same creative authority the Genesis account attributes to God at the very beginning of everything. And third, the part that should stay with you longest. Sending the healed man to wash in a pool named Sent wasn't incidental scenery. It tied this one miracle directly back to who Jesus said he was his entire ministry. Not merely a healer passing through, but the one sent by the Father, reenacting creation itself in the dirt of a Jerusalem road. Which layer of meaning in this miracle surprised you the most? The Genesis connection, the Sabbath timing, or the meaning hidden in the name of the pool itself? Tell me below. Because in the end, Jesus never needed the dirt. He chose it. And everything about that choice was pointing all along back to who he already was from the very beginning.